The red dust of the high plains settled on everything. It coated the raw lumber of the new train depot, a building that seemed to have sprung from the ground overnight, smelling of fresh pine and ambition. It filmed the inside of the window panes in the converted stable where Eleanor Vance taught the children of Red Hollow their letters. The dust was the first thing you tasted in the morning and the last thing you scrubbed from your skin at night. A train whistle, sharp and piercing, sliced through the quiet spring air. It was a sound that did not yet belong, a promise of progress to some and a threat to others. From the peaks of the Elk Trace Mountains, patches of stubborn snow gleamed in the sun, a reminder that winter had not entirely surrendered its grip. Inside the stable, the air was a mix of hay, horse, and chalk dust. Eleanor pointed a slender finger at the slate. "The letter A," she said, her voice calm and steady above the fidgeting of a dozen children on benches made of rough-hewn planks. After the children had been dismissed, their shouts fading as they scattered into the single dusty street. Eleanor sat alone at her small desk. The ledger felt heavy in her hands. It was the property of the Red Hollow Gazette, but its contents belonged to the town. Page after page of names, each followed by a number and the severe, spidery signature of Silas Pike, president of the Red Hollow Bank and Trust. The newspaper office was little more than a closet attached to the general store. Its press old, its paper thin and prone to tearing. The ink often faded before a story could find its way into every hand. But the ledger, its ink was bold and permanent. It was a book of chains forged from numbers, the debts of her neighbors, her friends, the parents of the children she taught. Her own family name was in there, too. A shadow fell across the open stable door. Silas Pike stood there, a man built of solid, prosperous flesh. He filled the doorway, his suit dark and clean despite the dust, a gold watch chain gleaming against his waistcoat. He smiled, a practiced expression that did not reach his pale eyes. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a smooth baritone that carried with ease. "I trust the day of learning was productive." "The children are bright," Eleanor answered. Closing the ledger, "They learn quickly." Pike stepped inside, his polished boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He looked around the makeshift schoolroom, at the slates and the worn-out primers. A noble endeavor, he mused, though hardly a profitable one. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. The town council, of which I am a humble member, has approved a fundraising social to aid the town, of course, and to assist certain ladies of good standing who find themselves in difficult circumstances. He let the words hang in the air. We are calling it a matchmaking gala, a chance for our community's unattached ranchers and businessmen to find suitable partners. Attendance is, of course, entirely voluntary. But for those families with outstanding accounts at the bank, it would be seen as a gesture of profound community spirit. He was not looking at her, but she felt his meaning as keenly as a cold wind. The names in the ledger, the unmarried daughters and widows. He was not selling tickets, he was issuing summons. On the far side of town, where the raw newness of the depot gave way to the ancient rhythm of the plains, a man moved with a silence that was its own language. Chayton, known as Red Elk to his people, led his pony toward the general store. The animal was burdened with tightly bound beaver and fox pelts, the result of a long and lonely season in the high country. The whispers started as soon as he was seen, a rustle of words that followed him like his own shadow. "There he is, the Crow Scout." They say he led the surveyors for the railroad. Brought nothing but trouble. Chayton did not look at them. His gaze was fixed forward, his face a mask of stoic patience carved by sun and wind. He had learned long ago that the words of these people were like summer insects, a buzzing annoyance that could not be stopped, only endured. He needed salt, flour, and cartridges. He would trade his furs, take what he needed, and be gone before the sun set behind the mountains. Inside the store, he waited as the owner served a woman ahead of him. His eyes scanned the room, missing nothing. They came to rest on a piece of paper nailed to the wall, fresh from the printing press. The letters were thick and black, shouting their message. A reward for information leading to the capture of the Crow arsonists who set fire to the railroad warehouse. It was a lie. The fire had been an excuse, a way to justify pushing his people farther from the rivers, from the land that had sustained them for generations. The lie was now printed and posted, made real by ink and paper. A deep, slow anger began to burn in his chest, an old fire he had learned to keep banked and low. Back in her schoolhouse, Eleanor lit a lamp against the gathering twilight. She was poring over another set of books. These belonging to the Drought Relief Fund. The town had donated what little it could, and a church group back east had sent a generous sum, but the numbers felt wrong. She found it finally, tucked into the back of the book, a receipt for 20 sacks of seed grain, signed by Silas Pike. It was dated from last month. She remembered the day the grain had arrived, but then she found another receipt for the same amount, on the same day, but for a different price, nearly double the first. A duplicate, one for the town records, and one, she suspected, for the bank. The relief fund was being bled dry from the inside. The door creaked open again. This time it was Sheriff Doyle, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his shirt. He took off his hat, revealing a bald, sweating head. "Working late, Miss Vance," he observed, his eyes lingering on the papers spread across her desk. "Just reviewing the town accounts," Eleanor said, her voice neutral. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Mr. Pike mentioned the social to you. I imagine he is a generous man, always looking out for the welfare of Red Hollow." He leaned against the doorframe, his bulk seeming to shrink the small space. "You know, a good girl, a smart girl like you. She ought not to worry her head with ledgers and numbers. She ought to find a good husband, a rancher. Maybe someone with enough land to pay off any old family debts. It makes life so much simpler." His words were meant to be friendly, a piece of fatherly advice, but they felt like the bars of a cage slowly closing around her. The debt, the fake social, the missing money. It was all one tightening knot. Chayton completed his trade. He strapped the sacks of flour and salt to his pony, his movements economical and precise as he prepared to leave. His eyes once more found the poster. The lie. He saw Silas Pike walk out of the saloon across the street, laughing with a pair of well-dressed men from the railroad. They looked at him, their laughter dying in their eyes. He saw the cold certainty of their power. They had the paper, the ink, the law, and the railroad. They could make any lie true. The church bell began to toll, a slow, deep clang that marked the end of the day. It was a sound of order, of faith, of community. But tonight, it felt different to Eleanor, a heavy, rhythmic counting of the town's troubles. Then, from the direction of the new tracks, the train whistle blew again, long and mournful in the fading light. It was the sound of a future rushing toward them, a future that threatened to grind the red dust, the quiet lives, and all their secret sorrows under its iron wheels. Eleanor looked down at the false receipt in her hand, the proof of a crime. Chayton turned his pony toward the mountains. The lie on the poster burned into his mind. The dust settled between them, on a town balanced on the knife edge of a quiet, desperate war. The night of the test run had the feel of a holiday. Families gathered along the freshly laid tracks, their faces lit by lanterns and the pale glow of a high moon. The steel bridge over Red Hollow Creek was the town's crown jewel, a skeletal promise of permanence spanning the dark water. The locomotive, black and immense, hissed steam into the cold air, a sleeping iron beast waiting for its master. Eleanor Vance stood with the other townsfolk, a small notebook in her pocket. She felt the vibration through the soles of her shoes as the engine began to move, its great wheels turning slowly, then faster, pulling a single, empty wooden freight car behind it. A cheer went up as the train reached the bridge. It moved smoothly across the steel trestle, its silhouette stark against the star-filled sky. It was a moment of triumph. A victory for Silas Pike in his vision of the future. Then, as the lone car cleared the far side of the bridge, the world dissolved into a flash of white-hot light and a deafening roar that echoed off the mountains. The freight car seemed to leap into the air, its wooden planks exploding outward in a shower of splinters and flame. The sound hammered against the eardrums of the crowd, followed by a sudden, shocked silence. Chaos erupted. People screamed, stumbling back from the tracks, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning pine and something else, something sharp and chemical. Before anyone else could react, Silas Pike was climbing onto a stack of railroad ties, his arms raised for quiet, his voice, practiced and powerful, cut through the panic. "Sabotage!" he bellowed, his face a mask of outrage. "The Crow have done this. They seek to stop progress, to keep us living in fear. This is an act of war against this town, against every decent man and woman here. Sheriff, form a posse. We will not let this stand." The crowd, frightened and confused, easily caught his anger. Men shouted their agreement, their fear turning into a thirst for vengeance. But Eleanor felt a cold knot of doubt in her stomach. She moved away from the panicked throng, her journalistic instincts taking over. She edged closer to the wreckage, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a deep-seated suspicion. The fire from the splintered car cast a flickering, hellish light on the scene. It was the smell that held her attention. It was not the clean scent of a campfire or a brush fire. It was thick with the stink of hot tar and a metallic sharpness that reminded her of the powder a traveling photographer had once used, a scent she now recognized as zinc. This was no simple torch thrown into a boxcar. This was something engineered. She pulled out her notebook, her fingers fumbling with a small pencil. In the unsteady light, she wrote down 2 words, tar, zinc powder. It was not proof, but it was a question, and questions were dangerous things in Red Hollow. A hand clamped down on her arm, hard and sudden. A man loomed over her, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. He smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. "I saw that teacher," he rasped, his voice low and menacing. "Writing things down. Some things are best left unseen and unwritten." His grip tightened, and a jolt of pure fear shot through her. Before she could scream, another figure moved out of the deeper shadows with the swiftness of a hunting cat. Chayton. His hand landed on the thick man's shoulder, not with a strike, but with a pressure that was somehow more threatening. The man grunted, his grip on Eleanor's arm loosening in surprise. "Let her go," Chayton said. The words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of cold stone. The man turned, ready with a curse, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Chayton's unblinking gaze. He released Eleanor and took a half-step back. 2 more men were emerging from the chaos behind him, drawn by the confrontation. "There he is," one of them shouted, pointing. "One of the murdering savages." Chayton did not wait. He grabbed Eleanor's hand, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her away from the tracks, away from the firelight, into the scrubland that bordered the town. "Run," he said, and the single word was all the command she needed. They ran, their footsteps pounding on the hard, dry earth. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of pursuit. They could not head for the main street. The posse would be forming there. Chayton led her through the darkness, his knowledge of the land their only guide. They plunged into a field of prickly pear cactus, the needles tearing at their clothes and skin. Eleanor gasped as a spine raked across her calf, but she did not slow down. The adrenaline numbed the pain. Chayton moved through the treacherous ground as if he could see every needle, his path sure and swift. He brought them to a halt at the edge of a deep, dry wash. Below them, a wide, round opening was set into the embankment, a drainage culvert built for the spring floods. "In there," he said, pulling her down the loose scree of the slope. The culvert was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay. They scrambled inside, pressing themselves against the cold, curved wall as the sound of their pursuers grew closer. Boots thudded on the ground directly above their heads. They heard men cursing as they fought through the cactus patch, for what felt like an eternity. They stood in the suffocating darkness, their breathing loud in the confined space. Eleanor could feel the warmth of Chayton's body next to hers, a steady, solid presence in the terrifying dark. Finally, the footsteps and voices receded, moving farther down the wash. They were safe, for now. The next morning, the town was a hornet's nest of fear and suspicion. Sheriff Doyle's posse had ridden out at dawn, full of righteous fury, and returned empty-handed. This only fueled the anger. By noon, a new notice was posted on the door of the general store, right next to the now obsolete reward poster. Silas Pike, in his capacity as head of the town council, had made an announcement. In light of the recent savage attack and the ongoing financial hardships facing our community, the matchmaking gala will now serve a more urgent and official purpose. The event will proceed as a formal selection ceremony. The unattached ladies from families with outstanding debts to the bank and trust are required to attend. Benevolent offers will be made by esteemed gentlemen of the community to assume these debts. In conjunction with proposals of marriage, non-attendance will be considered a forfeiture of all property and assets tied to the outstanding loans. Below the proclamation was a list of names. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she read her own. The pretense was gone. It was no longer a party. It was an auction block. She was standing there, the paper trembling in her hand, when Chayton appeared beside her. He had come back to town under the cover of the morning mist and had been watching, waiting. He looked from her pale face to the notice on the door. His expression was grim. "You cannot go," he said, his voice low so only she could hear. "Last night was a warning. The explosion was a lie to stir up hate. This," he gestured to the notice, "is the trap the lie was meant to bait." "And if I do not go," she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "he takes my family's home, the stable, everything. My father built that house. I will not let him have it." "He will have you instead," Chayton said, his words blunt. "It is a different kind of cage, but a cage all the same." Eleanor looked from the damning notice to the distant mountains where he lived, a world of clean air and freedom. Then she looked at the dusty street of Red Hollow, at the schoolhouse where she taught, at the small building that housed the town's only newspaper. This was her home, her fight. Running was not an option. "Then I have to go," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "If this is his trap, I will not hide from it. I will walk right into it, and I will find a way to tear it apart from the inside." The church was not a house of God that night. Its windows, usually dark and solemn, blazed with the light of dozens of oil lamps, casting a feverish yellow glow onto the dusty street. It was a light that did not promise sanctuary, but spectacle. Inside, the pews had been pushed against the walls to clear the floor, and the air, thick with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and cheap perfume, felt sacrilegious under the gaze of the stained glass saints. The men of Red Hollow, the ranchers and merchants, were gathered in knots, their voices loud and boisterous. They were not here to pray. They were here to bid. So, Eleanor Vance stood near the back with a handful of other women, their face pale and set. They were dressed in their Sunday best, a cruel irony that was not lost on any of them. Each of them represented a name in Silas Pike's ledger. They were the currency in this profane transaction. Eleanor watched as Mary Beth Miller, a young widow with 2 small children and a failing plot of land, was led to the small, raised platform near the altar. Silas Pike, beaming like a benevolent patriarch, addressed the crowd. Our dear Mary Beth, a pillar of strength in the face of hardship, her husband, a good man, left her with a heavy burden. The bank and trust has carried her for 2 seasons, a testament to our commitment to this community. Now, it is time for the community to give back. A rancher named Jedediah Croft, a man with a stained beard and hands like weathered slabs of wood, stepped forward. "I will take on the Miller debt," he announced, his voice booming. and I will offer 50 head of my best cattle as a bridal gift." A smattering of polite applause followed. There were no other offers. Mary Beth, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The matter was settled. She had been sold, and everyone pretended it was an act of Christian charity. Then Pike's eyes found Eleanor. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice slick with false courtesy. "Would you be so good as to join me?" A hush fell over the room as Eleanor walked to the platform. Unlike Mary Beth, she met the eyes of the men in the crowd. She saw pity in some, hunger in others, and cold calculation in most. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. She stood straight and tall as Pike began his speech. "Our school teacher," he began, "a woman of learning and refinement. The Vance family has a long, if complicated, history in Red Hollow. Their debt is considerable, but so is her value to our town. Her guidance of our children is a treasure. What gentleman here is prepared to secure that treasure for our community and for himself?" He was selling her like she was a prize mare. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot pressure behind her eyes. But before anyone could step forward, the great oak doors of the church swung inward with a groan. Every head turned. Framed in the dark rectangle of the doorway stood Chayton. He was not dressed for a social. He wore his trail-worn buckskins, and his long black hair was unbound. He moved into the room with a silent, fluid grace that made the shuffling, heavy-footed men in their Sunday suits look clumsy and loud. The room, which had been buzzing with conversation, fell into a dead, absolute silence. The only sound was the soft tread of his moccasins on the wooden floor. He walked directly to the platform, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. He stopped before Silas Pike and, without a word, reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a handful of silver coins and small, rough nuggets, letting them fall onto the platform with a series of sharp clinks. The silver was old and tarnished, earned from trapping and trading, not from interest and foreclosure. Then he stepped back outside for a moment and returned, leading his horse, a powerful paint with intelligent eyes. He left the animal standing just inside the doorway, its reins held loosely in his hand. "I am here to pay her debt," Chayton said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the silent church. "The silver and the horse, it is more than what is owed." A wave of murmurs and outright jeers rippled through the crowd. Men who had been silent in his presence a moment before now found their courage in the safety of the pack. An Indian trying to buy a white woman. One spat, savage audacity. Another hissed. Father O'Rourke, who had been hovering nervously near the altar, wrung his hands. "My son, this is highly irregular. This is a house of God." "And these are men of God?" Chayton asked, his gaze sweeping across the room, making each man who met his eyes feel a prickle of shame. Silas Pike, recovering from his initial shock, puffed out his chest. He saw his carefully orchestrated evening slipping from his control. "We have procedures," he said, his voice straining to sound authoritative. "This is a matchmaking gala, not a livestock auction. Offers are to be made in a spirit of civic duty and matrimonial intent." "Then let the woman choose," Chayton said simply. Pike laughed. A short, ugly sound. "The woman is collateral. She has no choice in the matter. The bank decides what is an acceptable settlement." "But the debt is being paid," a voice said. It was Eleanor. All eyes swung to her. She stepped forward, to the edge of the platform, so she was standing beside Pike, looking down at the shocked faces. She looked at Chayton, then she turned her gaze back to Silas Pike, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that silenced the room once more. "Mr. Pike, your own notice required my attendance to settle a debt. This man has offered payment in full. According to the laws you yourself are so fond of citing, you must accept it. The debt is the issue. Is it not, or is there some other transaction taking place here tonight?" Pike's face turned a mottled red. He was caught in the gears of his own machine. To refuse the payment would be to admit that this was not about the debt at all, but about control, about ownership. "Fine," he snarled. "Seeing he was trapped, the debt will be marked as paid, but the terms of this evening are clear. An offer accepted is a proposal of marriage." Eleanor gave him a small, cold smile. "I accept the payment," she said. "I accept my freedom from your ledger, and I choose to walk out of this church with the man who paid for it, not as his wife, but as a free citizen, who will be traveling with him to see that the evidence of your crimes reaches Circuit Judge Hollis Reed." The collective gasp in the room was sharp and loud. She had not just defied him, she had declared war. Pike's face contorted with fury. He could not stop her. The money was on the table, the debt was settled, and there were too many witnesses. He had been beaten, publicly, at his own game. Eleanor walked down from the platform. Chayton gathered his silver, leaving the horse's reins in the hands of a stunned Father O'Rourke as a donation for the trouble. Chayton said. He and Eleanor walked toward the door, the crowd parting before them like a sullen sea. They stepped out into the clean, cold night air. They had not gone 20 paces down the street when Sheriff Doyle came rushing out of the church behind them. "You cannot do this, Miss Vance," he panted. "He is a dangerous man. You are not safe." "I have never been less safe than I was in that church," Eleanor said without looking back. They walked on, leaving the sheriff and the stunned congregation behind them. They did not see Silas Pike give a quiet order to one of his men. They did not see the man hurry toward the small office of the Red Hollow Gazette. By the time the first light of dawn touched the mountains, a new poster was being nailed to the door of the general store. It covered the notice about the matchmaking gala. The ink was still wet. It showed a crude drawing of Chayton's face. Below it, in thick, black letters, were the words, "Wanted, for the abduction of a white woman. Eleanor Vance. A reward of $500 was offered for his capture, dead or alive." The trap had been sprung. The world became steep. The gentle dust of Red Hollow was replaced by sharp rock and the complaining ache of muscles Eleanor never knew she had. They climbed into the high country of the Elk Trace, leaving the town and its troubles in the valley below. A small, ugly scar on the vast green and brown skin of the earth. The air grew thin and cold, biting at her face and hands. Her city shoes, sturdy enough for a dusty street, were useless here. The leather grew slick on wet stones, and the thin soles offered no protection from the sharp edges of the trail. Chayton moved ahead of her, a silent, economical shadow. He seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, his steps sure and quiet. For the first 2 days, he spoke little, his attention focused on their back trail, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines behind them. But as they pushed deeper into the wilderness, into the land that was his home, he began to teach her. The lessons were not given in a classroom with a slate and chalk, but were spoken in quiet commands and gestures on the trail. He showed her how to build a fire that gave heat but almost no smoke, choosing the driest, deadest branches from the undersides of fallen pines and nesting them in a shallow pit shielded by rocks. "The smoke," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is a letter you send to your enemies. It tells them where you are." He taught her to walk on the patches of old, crusty snow that lingered in the shadows of the forest, placing her feet carefully to leave the faintest possible impression. Every broken twig, every overturned stone, was a word in a story anyone with the right eyes could read. He showed her their own tracks from the day before, already beginning to fade, and explained how the sun and wind would erase their passage. When they crossed a rushing, ice-cold creek, he stopped. He took a piece of charcoal from their last fire, crushed it into a coarse powder, and packed it into a small cloth bag with sand and fine pebbles. He poured the creek water through this makeshift filter into their canteens. The water came out slow, but clear. "Never drink what you have not cleaned," he told her. "The mountain is beautiful, but it is not kind." Eleanor was a quick study. The fear of being a burden, a liability that could get them both killed, was a powerful motivator. She listened, she watched, and she learned. The blisters on her heels broke and bled. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she never complained. She gritted her teeth and kept moving, earning a quiet, unspoken respect from the man who led her. On the third day, they arrived at his sister's camp. It was not a camp so much as a small, hidden homestead, nestled in a high meadow protected on three sides by a sheer granite cliff. Two sturdy lodges, their tanned hides weathered to a soft gray, stood near a grove of aspen. A small herd of horses grazed peacefully in the meadow. A woman was kneeling by a fire pit, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. She looked up as they approached, her face a younger, softer version of Chaitin's. Hannah Bluebird greeted her brother with a quiet embrace. She looked at Eleanor, her dark eyes taking in the torn dress, the exhausted lines on her face, and the painful way she walked. There was no suspicion in her gaze, only a calm compassion. "You are weary," she said to Eleanor, her voice like the rustle of leaves. "Come, sit." That afternoon was the first time Eleanor had felt truly safe since the night of the explosion. Hannah tended to her feet, applying a soothing salve of crushed leaves that immediately eased the stinging of the blisters. She gave them a hot, nourishing stew of rabbit and wild roots and a strong, bitter tea that warmed Eleanor to her bones. Later, as the sun began to sink behind the granite peaks, another visitor arrived. She was a small, older Chinese woman named Mei Lian, who led a mule laden with cloth-wrapped bundles. She and Hannah greeted each other like old friends, a comfortable alliance that clearly stretched back years. They spoke a mixture of English and Crow, trading their goods. Mei Lian offered bags of ginseng root and dried mushrooms, and in return, Hannah gave her bundles of willow bark and yarrow. Mei Lian's eyes, bright and intelligent, rested on Eleanor, the teacher from the town. She said, more a statement than a question, "Silas Pike has a long reach. Be careful. The railroad has made him a king with no conscience." She said it matter-of-factly, the way one might comment on the weather. She then turned to Chaitin, "Your old trouble, the Kellum boy, Evan. He has been seen riding with some of Pike's hired men. The past does not sleep long in these mountains." After Mei Lian departed, a somber mood settled over the camp. The mention of the name Kellum had drawn a curtain over Chaitin's face, a darkness Eleanor could not penetrate. The next days were a blur of learning. Hannah taught Eleanor how to stitch torn buckskin with an awl and sinew, her movements patient and precise. "It is the same for skin," she said, guiding Eleanor's clumsy fingers. "You must be clean, and your stitches must be even and strong." Chaitin took her to the far side of the meadow and put a carbine in her hands. It was heavier than she had expected, the wood smooth, the steel cold and purposeful. "You came to this land with books," he said. "Out here, this is the book you must learn to read." He showed her how to load it, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger gently, not pull it. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, bruising her, and the sound of the shot was a violent crack that made her flinch. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the fallen log they were using as a target. She felt a flush of shame, of inadequacy, but Chaitin was patient. He corrected her stance, showed her how to brace the rifle against her body. Again, he said. She fired again and again, slowly. Her fear of the weapon was replaced by a grim focus. She learned to control her breathing, to hold the rifle steady, and finally, a bullet struck the log with a satisfying thud. It was a small victory, but it felt immense. It was the first time since leaving Red Hollow that she felt she had any power over her own fate. One evening, Hannah asked her to fetch an old, splintered lodgepole from a pile near the edge of the woods to use for firewood. As Eleanor lifted the heavy pole, she noticed a section near the base felt different. There was a small, round piece of wood that did not quite match the grain. It was a plug. Curious. She worked it loose with her fingernails. It came free, revealing a dark, hollow space inside the pole. She reached into the cavity. Her fingers closed around an oilskin pouch. Her heart began to beat faster. She pulled it out and unwrapped it by the flickering light of the campfire. Inside were two items, a thin ledger book and a folded, brittle letter. The letter was written in a cramped, frantic hand. The ink was faded in places, but the most chilling detail was a dark, reddish-brown stain that covered the bottom corner of the page. Flaking like old rust, it was dried blood. "My name is Abel Morris," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "I was the chief accountant for the Red Hollow Bank and Trust. If you are reading this, then Silas Pike has made good on his threats, and I am dead." Chayton and Hannah, who had been speaking quietly by the fire, fell silent, their attention fixed on her. "He has been stealing from this town for years." Eleanor continued reading. "The Drought Relief Fund, falsified freight manifests for the railroad, land deeds acquired through blackmail. I helped him. God forgive me. I was a coward, and he threatened my family. He has a ledger, a real one, locked in his safe. This book," she held up the small ledger, "is my own copy, my attempt to understand his system. He is planning something terrible. A final delivery to the railroad depot. A crate of what he calls wolf's bane, aconite. He means to poison the wells upstream on the Crow Reservation, to clear them out for good. He said the railroad requires it." The explosion at the bridge was just the beginning. Eleanor looked at the ledger. It was filled with the same cramped handwriting, but it was mostly numbers and strange symbols. A code she could not understand, but a few words were clear: railroad, depot, aconite. She felt a wave of cold dread, but also a surge of fierce resolve. This was it, the proof. More than just theft. This was a confession of conspiracy and planned mass murder. That night, as she sat by the fire, the bloody letter clutched in her hand, she felt the weight of her helplessness again. "I do not know what to do with this," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I am a schoolteacher. I am not a fighter or a spy. I am a liability to you." Chayton, who had been staring into the flames, his face a mask of old sorrows, finally looked at her. "10 years ago," he said, his voice low and rough with memory, "there was a fire at my family's old winter camp. The Kellum Ranch was new then. They thought we had stolen a horse. They came in the night with torches. There was a fight. Their father died. It was self-defense, but no one would have believed it. So I ran. For 10 years, I have carried the ghost of that night. I know what it is to feel like a liability. But you," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the flames, "you are not running. You brought the truth out of that town. You are not a liability. You are the one who carries the proof." In his words, in the quiet sharing of his own deep wound, she felt a profound shift. He was not just her protector, and she was not just a woman he had rescued. They were partners, bound together by a shared danger and a shared purpose. The work of building trust had begun, not with grand promises, but with the simple, difficult act of telling a painful truth by a small, smokeless fire, high in the mountains. The first sign of the change was not in the sky, but in the silence. The constant chatter of squirrels in the pines, the distant call of an eagle. The very hum of the mountain seemed to die away, leaving an expectant, hollow quiet. Chayton stopped splitting wood and lifted his head, sniffing the air. It had lost its crisp, clean scent, and now carried a damp, heavy coldness that felt out of place for late spring. "Look," Hannah said, pointing to the west. A wall of bruised, purple-gray clouds was rolling over the granite peaks, swallowing the blue sky with an unnatural speed. It did not look like a rainstorm. It was too solid, too dark. "A freak storm," Chayton said, his voice grim, "and it is coming fast." The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then the wind hit them. It was not a breeze, but a physical blow, a howling gale that tore through the meadow. Bending the tall aspen trees nearly double, the temperature plummeted. Eleanor, who had been practicing her aim with the carbine at the far end of the meadow, felt the cold slice through her thin dress like a knife. The first snowflakes, huge and wet, began to fall, not drifting, but driven almost horizontally by the wind. "The horses!" Chayton shouted over the rising roar of the storm. They worked with a desperate, unspoken understanding. The three of them herded the frightened horses into the thickest part of the aspen grove, the dense stand of trees offering a meager shield against the wind's fury. They threw heavy canvas tarps and old blankets over the animals' backs, tying them down as best they could against the gale. Within minutes, the world was gone, replaced by a blinding, swirling curtain of white. The ground, which had been a carpet of new spring grass, vanished under a layer of snow that was already inches deep. "Food!" Hannah yelled, her voice barely audible. "We must protect the supplies." Inside the larger of the two lodges, the wind shrieked through the smoke hole, and fine, powdery snow dusted everything. The fire in the central pit hissed and spat as flakes found their way down. Working by the unsteady light of a single lantern, they pried up the loose floorboards in the center of the lodge. They dug a deep cache in the cold, hard earth beneath, lining it with dry hides. Into this makeshift cellar, they packed their precious supplies, sacks of flour and cornmeal, salted meat, dried berries, coffee, and the tins of salt and sugar. If they were snowed in for days, they would need every last bit of it. Eleanor worked alongside them, her hands raw and aching from the cold and the digging. Her fear a tight knot in her chest. But the focused, frantic labor left no room for panic. There was only the task at hand, the next sack to be moved, the next shovelful of dirt. They sealed the floorboards back in place, just as the full fury of the blizzard descended. For 2 days, the world outside ceased to exist. They lived in a twilight world inside the lodge, the wind a constant, deafening scream. They kept the fire low but steady, a small orange heart of warmth in the vast, howling cold. They ate sparingly and spoke little, conserving their energy. In the long hours of enforced stillness, Eleanor watched Chayton. He was not idle. He cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, sharpened his knives, and mended a tear in his moccasins with a quiet, focused intensity. He seemed to draw strength from the storm, as if its wildness was a language he understood. She, in turn, drew a strange comfort from his calm. He was a man who knew how to endure. On the morning of the third day, they woke to a profound silence. The wind had died. Sunlight, brilliant and almost painful, streamed through the smoke hole, illuminating a world transformed. Chayton pushed open the heavy hide flap of the lodge. Eleanor gasped. The meadow was buried under 4 feet of pure, unbroken white. Every tree was laden with a heavy coat of snow, their branches drooping. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. The air was so cold and still it seemed to crackle. It was a scene of breathtaking, pristine beauty. But Chayton was not looking at the beauty. He was looking at the snow itself, his expression hard. "The snow tells a story," he said quietly. "And now, our story is easy to read. Anyone who comes looking will see our every move. There is no hiding now." They spent the day digging out. They cleared paths to the horses, who were cold and miserable but alive. They checked their food cache, which was safe and dry. The work was hard, the sun on the snow blinding. But the physical effort was a relief after being trapped inside. By late afternoon, a fragile sense of normalcy had returned. They were alive, they were safe, and the storm had passed. The relief made them careless. The attack came at dawn. The first rays of sun were just touching the highest peaks, painting them a soft rose gold. The meadow was still cast in the blue shadows of morning. Eleanor was by the fire pit, coaxing a flame for the morning coffee, when a chickadee in a nearby pine tree suddenly burst into frantic, alarmed chirping and flew away. A moment later, a sound like an angry hornet buzzed past her ear, and the wooden post of the drying rack beside her exploded in a shower of splinters. She froze, the tin coffee pot dropping from her hand and spilling dark grounds onto the snow. "Down!" Chaitin's voice was a sharp crack in the morning stillness. He launched himself from the lodge entrance, tackling her and driving her into the soft snow behind the fire pit, shielding her with his own body. A second shot rang out, the bullet thudding into the packed earth where she had been standing. He pushed a rifle into her hands, the carbine she'd been practicing with. "Stay low," he commanded. He crawled to the side of the lodge, using it for cover, and peered out toward the rocky ridge that overlooked the meadow. 4 of them, he hissed, spread out along the rocks. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Eleanor. Her hands trembled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This was not practice. The target was not a log. The men on that ridge were here to kill them. Then she looked at Chaitin's face. It was a mask of deadly calm. His eyes narrowed, his movements precise as he loaded his own rifle. His calm was an anchor in her sea of fear. Hannah was already moving, crawling from the second lodge with a small bundle of medical supplies, her face grim but resolute. Eleanor remembered her lessons. Squeeze. Do not pull. Control your breathing. She pressed herself against the frozen ground, resting the carbine on the low rock wall of the fire pit. She could see them now, dark shapes against the snow-covered rocks, the occasional glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. Chaitin fired, the report of his rifle echoing in the still air. One of the figures on the ridge ducked back behind a boulder. He was buying them time, drawing their fire. A volley of shots answered him, bullets chewing into the thick hide walls of the lodge. They had them pinned down. Eleanor knew she was not a good enough shot to hit a man at that distance, but Chaitin had taught her more than just how to shoot. He had taught her how to think. Smoke, he had said. Smoke is a letter to your enemies. She looked at the small, clean fire in the pit. What if she sent the wrong message? While the attackers were focused on Chaitin, she scrambled on her belly to the edge of the woods, gathering handfuls of damp, half-frozen leaves and moss from beneath the snow. She crawled back to the fire pit and threw the wet foliage onto the flames. The fire sputtered and hissed, and then a thick column of greasy, white smoke billowed upwards. The morning air was so still that the smoke hung in a dense, choking cloud, obscuring the camp from the men on the ridge. Good, Chaitin grunted in approval from his position. Keep it coming. Coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke, Eleanor kept feeding the fire. The rifle fire from the ridge became more sporadic, their targets now hidden. The smoke screen was working. One of the men, growing impatient, broke cover and started moving down the slope, trying to get a better angle. It was the mistake Chaitin had been waiting for. His rifle barked once. The man on the slope cried out, a sharp, ugly sound, and crumpled, clutching his leg. The brief moment of triumph was shattered an instant later. Another rifle cracked from the ridge. A desperate, angry shot fired blindly into the smoke. Chaitin cried out, not in pain, but in a sharp, involuntary grunt, and staggered back a step, his left arm going limp at his side. He slid down the wall of the lodge, his rifle clattering onto the snow. The 2 remaining attackers, seeing their partner wounded and their advantage lost, decided they had had enough. They dragged their injured comrade back over the ridge and disappeared. The silence that descended was more shocking than the gunfire. Eleanor rushed to Chaitin's side. A dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. His face was pale, his jaw clenched against a wave of pain. It is deep, Hannah said, her voice tight with urgency as she knelt beside him, cutting away the bloody fabric with a small, sharp knife. The bullet had torn a long, deep furrow through the muscle of his shoulder. It was not a clean hole, but a ragged, bleeding trench. We have to close it, now! The world narrowed to the ragged, gaping wound in Chaitin's shoulder. The pristine white snow all around was now spattered with a shocking, brilliant red. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the scent of blood and the sharp, clean smell of pine. Hannah worked quickly, wiping away the excess blood with a piece of hide, her face a mask of concentration. Pressure, she said, her voice tight. We have to slow the bleeding. Find me every clean piece of cloth we have." Eleanor flew into motion. Her earlier fear burned away by the fire of necessity. She tore through their meager supplies, her hands shaking. There was a small roll of linen, but it was stained with grease. The flour sacks were too coarse, the spare blankets too thick and dirty. Nothing was right. Nothing was clean enough to put into an open wound. The blood was still coming, a steady, dark seep that soaked the furs beneath him. He was losing too much, too fast. In desperation, she looked down at her own clothes. Her dress was torn and filthy from their flight and the fight, but beneath it, her petticoat was mostly clean. It was her only option. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and panic, fumbled with the buttons at her waist. She tried to hurry, pulling at the fabric, searching for a place to tear a strip. The placket of her dress, already weakened from her scramble through the cactus, gave way under her frantic pulling. With a sound of tearing stitches, the front of her bodice fell open. For a heartbeat, she was frozen. The cold air hit her skin, a shocking contrast to the frantic heat of her fear. Chayton, his head lolling against Hannah's arm, his eyes glazed with pain and the first tendrils of fever, looked up at that exact moment. He was not entirely conscious, lost in a gray world of shock and agony, but his eyes focused on her, on the sudden, startling expanse of her pale skin, the simple white of her chemise in the dim light of the lodge. His body, already pressed close as Hannah worked, leaned into her as a wave of dizziness washed over him. His feverish cheek brushed against her bare shoulder. She opened her dress by mistake. The warrior whispered it, his voice a broken, rattling thing, his breath hot against her neck. "God help me." His body sagged against her skin. It was not a plea of desire, but the prayer of a man at the very edge of his endurance, overwhelmed by pain, by the sudden, shocking intimacy of a life and death struggle. Eleanor felt a tremor run through him, and through herself. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman, not a crow and a white schoolteacher. They were two people clinging to life, surrounded by the smell of blood and pine, their bodies connected by a shared, desperate fight against the encroaching darkness. "Tear it!" Hannah's sharp command cut through the charged stillness. "Now!" The order broke the spell. Eleanor's mind cleared. She ripped a long, wide strip from her petticoat, the sound of the tearing fabric loud in the silent lodge. She folded it into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound. Chayton groaned, a low, animal sound of pure pain, his muscles tensing under her hands. She held the pressure, her arms trembling with the effort, her own fear a distant, unimportant thing. Hannah was already moving. She had a small deerskin pouch from which she produced a bone needle and a length of fine, strong sinew. She held it out to Eleanor. "You must do this. My hands are not steady enough for such fine work, but your stitching is neat. I have seen it." Eleanor stared at the needle, then at the mangled flesh of his shoulder. "I cannot. I am a teacher. I mend clothes, not people." "You taught yourself to fire a rifle," Hannah said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You will teach yourself to do this. I will guide you." She produced a small, dark glass bottle. Malian left this carbolic acid, for when the wound is deep and the world is unclean, it will burn, but it will stop the poison. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. She poured a small amount of the stinging liquid onto a piece of cloth. As she dabbed it gently into the wound, Chayton's body arched in a silent scream, his teeth gritting so hard she could hear them grind. She flinched, a wave of sympathetic agony washing over her. But she did not stop. She cleaned the entire length of the gash, her movements becoming more certain, more deliberate. Then she took the needle. Hannah showed her how to hold it, how to push it through the tough resilience of his skin. The first stitch was the hardest. She felt the resistance, the slight pop as the needle pierced his flesh. A fresh bead of blood welled up. She pulled the sinew tight, drawing the edges of the wound together. Her stomach churned. But her hands grew steady. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the chaos of the past week narrowed to this single, focused point, one stitch, and then the next. She worked in a trance, Hannah's calm voice a constant murmur at her ear. "Pull it tight, but not so tight it tears. Keep them even, that is it. You are doing well." Chayton had lapsed into a half-conscious state, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. He was enduring, leaving her to do the work that had to be done, stitch by stitch. She closed the wound, her movements becoming a grim, determined rhythm. When she tied off the final knot, her entire body was shaking with exhaustion and release. Hannah immediately applied a thick, dark poultice of crushed herbs over the stitches and bound his shoulder tightly with the rest of the torn petticoat. He was alive. The bleeding had stopped. Later, as a fragile twilight settled over the snowbound meadow, Chayton drifted in the gray lands between sleep and waking. The fever had taken hold, and he shivered violently under a pile of furs. Eleanor sat beside him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. In a moment of lucidity, his eyes opened and focused on her. He saw the torn front of her dress, which she had pinned shut as best she could. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice raw. She shook her head. "We saved each other." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. Then he spoke again, his voice weak but clear. "We cannot stay here. Pike's men will be back." "I know," she said. She looked down at the oilskin pouch which she had kept beside her, the confession of Abel Morris lying within. The weight of it felt heavier than ever. "There is only one thing left to do. When we go down this mountain, we are telling the whole truth. To Judge Reed. No more running." It was not a question. It was a vow, a promise made in the quiet of a snowbound lodge, in the aftermath of violence and the shared intimacy of survival. Chayton held her gaze, and in his fever-bright eyes, she saw a flicker of the old fire. He gave a single, slow nod. No more running. The plan took shape over the next day as Chayton's fever began to recede, replaced by a deep, healing exhaustion. They could not ride down the main trail. The whole valley would be watching for them. The reward on Chayton's head made every man with a rifle a potential enemy. "There is another way," Chayton said, his voice still weak but his mind sharp. "The old Black Snake silver mine. It has been abandoned for 20 years. The main entrance is collapsed, but the ventilation shafts on the north face of the mountain are still open. One of them runs deep. It comes out behind the old livery stable in town, the one I used to teach in." Eleanor's voice was a whisper. He nodded. "They will not be looking for you to come from beneath their feet." It was a desperate, dangerous plan. The shafts could be unstable, the air foul, but it was their only chance. "I will not let you go alone," he said. "You cannot fight," she countered gently. "You can barely stand." He managed a grim smile. "I do not have to fight. I just have to be seen. I will take a horse and circle around to the east. I will make a fire, a big one with plenty of smoke, down by the new railroad tie depot. When they see the smoke, Pike and his men will think I am trying to burn them out. They will all ride that way. It will give you the time you need to get through the mine and find the judge. He is always at the Grand Hotel when he is in Red Hollow." The risk was enormous, for both of them. He would be a wounded man, alone, drawing the attention of a dozen armed pursuers. She would be crawling through the dark, unknown belly of the earth. But as she looked at him, at the freshly stitched wound on his shoulder, at the unyielding determination in his eyes, she knew they had no other choice. Their flight was over. It was time to descend from the mountain and bring the fire and the truth down with them. The separation happened at the foot of the mountain, in the cold blue shadow of dawn. The entrance to the Black Snake mine was little more than a jagged scar in the rock face, choked with weeds and the debris of a generation of neglect. Chayton's face was pale, drawn with pain, but his eyes were clear and hard. He adjusted the sling Hannah had made for his arm. "You are sure you can do this?" Eleanor asked, her voice a low whisper. The oilskin pouch containing the letter and ledger felt heavy and warm in her hands, a stark contrast to the icy fear in her stomach. "I am sure I can make smoke," he answered, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "It is the one skill they expect of me." He looked at the narrow, dark opening of the mine shaft. "The hard part is yours. Do not stop for anything. Do not look back." He touched her good shoulder, his hand lingering for just a moment. It was not a gesture of affection, but of solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that lay between them. Then he was gone, melting into the trees on the one good horse they had left, a silent shadow moving east toward the railroad depot. Eleanor turned and faced the darkness. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and plunged into the earth. The tunnel was a cold, damp throat that seemed to swallow the light behind her. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of wet rock and something else, a dead, metallic scent of forgotten labor. Water dripped from the low ceiling, the rhythmic plink-plonk echoing in the profound silence, each drop sounding like a footstep behind her. She held a single, tallow-scented candle, its small, sputtering flame casting huge, dancing shadows that twisted the rough rock walls into monstrous shapes. She moved slowly, one hand on the damp, slimy wall for guidance, the other clutching the precious pouch to her chest. The floor was uneven, littered with loose rock that threatened to turn her ankle with every step. Twice she stumbled, her heart leaping into her throat as the candle flame dipped and nearly went out. The thought of being left in that absolute, suffocating blackness was a more potent fear than any of Silas Pike's hired guns. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the next step, and the next. She thought of Chayton, imagining a column of smoke rising against the blue sky. She thought of the children in her schoolhouse, their face trusting and innocent. She thought of Abel Morris, his life ending in a splash of blood on a piece of paper. These thoughts were her fuel, pushing her forward through the cold and the dark. Then she smelled it, faint at first, then stronger, the scent of hay and old leather. A familiar, comforting smell. A sliver of gray light appeared ahead. Hope surged through her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She scrambled the last few yards, pushing aside a rotten timber brace, and emerged, blinking and covered in grime, into the back of her old schoolhouse, the livery stable. The stable was quiet, the stalls empty. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, looking impossibly bright. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then she heard it, a distant shouting from the east side of town. The diversion. Chayton's plan was working. She moved quickly, slipping out the stable door and keeping to the alleyways. The town looked the same, yet entirely different. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every drawn curtain a pair of watching eyes. The shouting grew louder, and she saw a group of men on horseback gallop down the main street, heading east. Among them was Sheriff Doyle, his face red with excitement. The entire town was being drawn toward the fire, leaving its heart unguarded. The Grand Hotel was the largest building in Red Hollow, a two-story monument to Silas Pike's ambition. Eleanor smoothed her torn and dirty dress as best she could, tucked the oilskin pouch securely inside her bodice, and walked through the front doors. The clerk behind the desk looked up, his expression of polite welcome freezing into one of disapproval as he took in her disheveled appearance. She paid him no mind. "I am here to see Judge Hollis Reed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is a matter of the utmost urgency." The clerk was about to refuse when a door opened down the hall. A tall, silver-haired man with a stern, deeply lined face and eyes as clear and gray as a winter sky stepped out. "I am Judge Reed," he said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze missing nothing, from the grime on her face to the fierce determination in her eyes. "What is this urgent matter, young woman?" In his private suite, with the door securely locked, Eleanor pulled out the pouch. Her hands shook as she laid the blood-stained letter and the coated ledger on his polished mahogany table. "I am Eleanor Vance," she began, "and I am accusing Silas Pike of fraud, theft, and murder." Judge Reed listened without interruption, his face impassive, as she told him everything. She told him about the duplicate receipts for the Drought Relief Fund, the matchmaking gala that was a dead auction, the explosion at the bridge, and the attack on their camp in the mountains. Finally, she pushed the letter toward him. This was written by Abel Morris, the bank accountant. He has been missing for 3 months. The judge picked up the letter. He read it once, then a second time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He examined the dark stain on the corner, his expression grim. He then turned his attention to the ledger. "These symbols," he said, tapping a page. "What do they mean?" "A friend helped us understand," Eleanor said, thinking of Malian's quiet wisdom. "This one," she pointed, "means aconite, wolf's bane. And these entries correspond to shipments received at the railroad depot, paid for by the bank, but delivered to a warehouse owned by Mr. Pike. He was planning to poison the wells on the Crow Reservation." A heavy silence filled the room. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. He looked not at the evidence, but at Eleanor. "Do you understand the gravity of this accusation? Miss Vance, you are accusing the most powerful man in this territory of crimes that will see him hang. I understand that he will kill more innocent people if he is not stopped," Eleanor answered, her voice ringing with conviction. Outside, the situation was escalating. Silas Pike, seeing the pillar of smoke from the tie depot, had seized his opportunity. He stood on the porch of the general store, his voice booming across the street. "It is the savage. Chayton. He is trying to burn us out, just like he burned the freight car. And he has our teacher, Miss Vance. We must rescue her from his clutches before it is too late." He was whipping the town's fear into a frenzy, directing it. The men who'd been galloping east now turned back, their faces grim, their rifles ready. They formed a disorganized, angry mob, and their attention was turning toward the one place in town that represented outside authority, the Grand Hotel. As the crowd surged toward the hotel, a lone figure moved to block their path. It was Isaiah Brooks, the freedman who drove the mail stage. He sat tall on the seat of his coach, the reins in his hands, his old cavalry hat pulled low. He did not draw a weapon. He simply sat there, a calm, immovable obstacle. "That is far enough, gentlemen." Isaiah's voice was deep and steady, carrying easily over the grumbling of the crowd. "The judge is conducting official business. He is not to be disturbed. Get out of the way. Brooks," Sheriff Doyle shouted, pushing his way to the front. "This is a town matter." Isaiah looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "I answer to the federal government, Sheriff, not to a mob. My only business is to see that the law is respected, and right now, the law is in that hotel." Inside, Judge Reed had made his decision. He stood and walked to his writing desk. He took out a piece of official paper and dipped his pen in the inkwell. "Miss Vance," he said without turning around, "I will need you to raise your right hand and swear an oath. I need your testimony, under penalty of perjury, that everything you have told me and everything contained in these documents is, to the best of your knowledge, the truth." Eleanor stood, her back straight, and raised her hand. "I swear," she said, her voice clear and strong. The scratch of the judge's pen filled the room. He wrote swiftly, his script sharp and decisive. He finished with a flourish and sprinkled sand over the ink to dry it. He then turned, a warrant in his hand. It was an order for the immediate arrest of Silas Pike on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and suspicion of murder. He wrote a second document, a writ authorizing the federal marshal to seal the premises of the Red Hollow Bank and Trust, and to seize all its contents as evidence. The gears of justice had begun to turn. The sun rose on a different Red Hollow. The anger that had curdled into a mob the night before had evaporated, leaving behind a nervous, unsettled quiet. People moved about their morning chores with their eyes downcast, a collective shame hanging in the air. They had been played for fools, their fears expertly manipulated, and the morning light was a harsh judge. Judge Hollis Reed did not wait for the town to fully awaken. Accompanied by Isaiah Brooks and a grim-faced federal marshal he had telegraphed during the night, he walked from the hotel to the front steps of the Red Hollow Bank and Trust. Silas Pike was just arriving, his face a thunderous mask. He had clearly spent the night plotting his recovery, ready to reassert his authority. He saw the judge and the marshal, and his step faltered for just a moment. "Judge Reed," Pike began, his voice attempting its usual booming confidence, "I trust you will be launching a full investigation into the savage who terrorized my town." "I am," the judge replied, his voice flat and cold, "but my investigation begins here. Silas Pike, you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and on suspicion of the murder of Abel Morris." Pike's face, which had been red with bluster, turned the color of old parchment. He sputtered, trying to form a protest, but the marshal was already on him, snapping iron cuffs onto his wrists with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the town square. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. They stood in absolute silence, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. This was not how their world was supposed to work. The powerful were not supposed to fall. Sheriff Doyle hurried forward, his hand on his pistol. "Now see here, Judge, you cannot just come into my town and—" The judge turned his cold gray eyes on the sheriff. "Your authority in this town is hereby suspended. Sheriff, pending an investigation into your own complicity in these matters, you will stand down, or you will join Mr. Pike in these cuffs." Doyle's face went slack. The fight drained out of him, leaving a deflated, suddenly pathetic figure. He took his hand off his weapon and stepped back into the silent crowd. The marshal then produced a heavy iron bar. On the judge's order, he began to work on the door of the bank. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the square. Once inside, they went directly to Pike's office. The safe, a large, black iron box, stood in the corner like a silent accomplice. A blacksmith was summoned. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were the rhythmic clang of his hammer against a chisel and the straining groans of the safe's locking mechanism. The crowd outside grew, but the silence held. It was a vigil for the truth. Finally, with a loud crack, the heavy door swung open. Judge Reed reached inside and pulled out a large, leather-bound ledger. It was twice as thick as the one the town had seen. He opened it on Pike's desk. Even from a distance, the crowd could see the pages were filled with dense, neat columns of figures, a meticulous record of a decade of theft. Then, from the back of the safe, the judge removed a small, corked glass vial filled with a clear liquid. He held it up to the light. "Aconite," he said, his voice carrying to the stunned onlookers, "enough to poison a river." A collective shudder went through the crowd. They had been ready to ride out and deliver violence to an innocent man, all while the real monster was planning to kill their neighbors on a scale they could not imagine. The silence was no longer one of shock. It was one of profound, sickening guilt. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Eleanor and Chayton were ready to leave. The town was no longer a threat to them, but it was not a home either. Judge Reed had taken Eleanor's formal deposition. He had thanked her, his stern face softening for a moment with a look of deep respect. Chayton's name had been cleared. The false wanted poster torn down and replaced by the judge's warrant. But the wounds, both visible and invisible, remained. They needed the clean air of the mountains to heal. They took a little used trail that led through Black Snake Canyon, a narrow, winding passage carved by an ancient river. The high rock walls on either side blocked out the sun, plunging them into a cool, gray twilight. The sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground was the only sound. They were halfway through the canyon when the first pebble skittered down the cliff face in front of them. Chayton reined in his horse, his body instantly alert, his good hand resting on the stock of his rifle. Then a voice echoed from the rim of the canyon above. "That is far enough, Red Elk." Eleanor looked up. 5 men stood silhouetted against the bright sky. 4 of them were rough-looking men she recognized as Pike's hired guns. The 5th, standing slightly apart, was younger. He had a lean, hungry look, and his eyes burned with a cold, old fire. It was Evan Kellum. "The circle closes," Chayton said, his voice low and weary. "Evan?" Eleanor called out, her own voice tight with fear. "What is this? The fight in town is over. Pike is in chains." "This is not Pike's fight!" Evan Kellum shouted down, his voice cracking with a decade of nursed hatred. "This is my fight. It started 10 years ago, the night you murdered my father." The 4 other men raised their rifles, taking aim. Chayton did not reach for his weapon. He simply sat on his horse, his wounded arm in its sling, and looked up at the man on the ridge. "I did not murder your father. Evan, your father and his brothers came to my family's lodge in the middle of the night. They came with torches. They were going to burn us out, burn us alive, over a horse we did not steal. My father tried to reason with them. Your father struck him down. I fought to defend my home, to defend my mother. Your father died in that fight. I have never denied it. But it was not murder. It was a simple recitation of facts, delivered without anger or apology. It was the truth, spoken aloud for the first time, echoing off the canyon walls. Evan Kellum's face was a twisted mask of grief and rage. "You lie!" he screamed. "He was a good man. He was a man who brought fire to an innocent family's home," Chayton said, his voice still quiet, still weary. "That is the truth you have been running from." Eleanor saw Evan's finger tighten on the trigger of his rifle. In that moment, she knew that words of denial or argument would be useless. She swung down from her horse. "Eleanor, no!" Chayton warned. She ignored him. She stood in the middle of the canyon floor, her hands held open at her sides, a small, unarmed figure against the immense stone walls. She looked up at Evan Kellum. "What happens if you pull that trigger, Evan?" she asked, her voice calm and clear. A teacher reasoning with a difficult student. Justice was served in Red Hollow this morning. We all saw it. A man who committed crimes was arrested, and he will face a judge and a jury. That is justice. If you shoot this man, what is that? It is just more killing. It is a fire that will never go out. Your father will still be gone, and Chayton's family will have lost a son. Nothing will be paid for. The debt will only get bigger. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "The old women in town, they still talk about your mother. They said she had the prettiest garden in the valley. They told me what she used to call you when you were just a boy, when you would fall and scrape your knee. Evie." The name, so soft and so out of place in that violent standoff, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. His face crumpled. The hard lines of the vengeful man dissolved, and for a second, she saw the boy he had been. At that exact moment, a sharp, cracking sound echoed from high up on the canyon wall. A section of rock, loosened by the spring thaw, broke free. It was not a huge landslide, just a cascade of stones and dust, but it came tumbling down the cliff face with a deafening roar, landing with a heavy crash just a few yards from where Evan and his men stood. The canyon fell silent, the dust slowly settling. Nature itself had spoken, a gavel of stone and gravity. Evan Kellum stared at the pile of fresh rock, then down at Eleanor, and then at Chayton. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the barrel of his rifle. The other men, mercenaries with no stake in this personal war, looked at him, then at each other, and followed his lead. No words were spoken. The moment of truth, the climax of a 10-year vendetta, had passed. Without another look, Evan Kellum turned and walked away from the canyon rim, his 4 men trailing behind him. They were gone. Eleanor let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her legs suddenly weak. Chayton nudged his horse forward and stopped beside her. He looked down, his face unreadable. She looked up at him. "It is over," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his gaze on the empty space where Evan Kellum had stood. "Yes," he said, "it is over." The arrest of Silas Pike was not the end of the story. It was the pulling of a single, rotten thread that caused a whole tapestry of deceit to unravel. Judge Reed was a meticulous and implacable force. With Pike's secret ledger as his map, he and his marshal began a systematic dismantling of a decade of corruption. One by one, the farmers and ranchers who had been squeezed off their land were called into the hotel. They came in tentatively, their faces etched with a deep, weary suspicion of any legal authority. The judge showed them the forged signatures, the inflated interest calculations, the deeds that had been illegally transferred to the bank's name. He showed them the truth in black and white. Men who had lost everything, who had believed themselves failures, stared at the pages, and a slow, fierce light of understanding dawned in their eyes. The original deeds found in Pike's safe were returned. Families who had been preparing to leave the valley forever now had a reason to stay. They did not celebrate with shouts, but with a deep, quiet reverence, clutching the precious papers in their work-hardened hands as if they were holy scripture. The Drought Relief Fund was the next to be resurrected. The judge's investigation revealed a complex scheme of phantom suppliers and inflated invoices. With the bank's assets frozen, he was able to recover a substantial portion of the stolen money. He appointed a new town council, made up of Father O'Rourke, Isaiah Brooks, and a stern, no-nonsense rancher's widow named Martha Gable. Their first act was to use the recovered funds to purchase the seed grain the town had desperately needed all along. Sheriff Doyle, stripped of his badge and his authority, tried to bluster his way out of trouble, claiming ignorance. But Abel Morris's letter had detailed Doyle's role as Pike's enforcer, the man who delivered the threats and served the false eviction notices. Faced with the dead accountant's words and the cold, unwavering stare of Judge Reed, Doyle's bravado crumbled. He was formally dismissed, and the federal marshal took over the town's law enforcement until a replacement could be appointed. The symbol of Pike's corrupt power was gone, leaving a vacuum that, for the first time, felt like an opportunity rather than a threat. While the judge untangled the legal knots, Eleanor went back to her own work. The small office of the Red Hollow Gazette came back to life, with paper and ink supplied by a grateful merchant, and with Isaiah Brooks volunteering to run the old press. Eleanor set to work writing the most important story of her life. She did not write a story of heroes and villains. She simply laid out the facts. Quoting extensively from Abel Morris's confession, she included a key, provided by Melian, that deciphered the symbols in the secret ledger, showing the cold, methodical planning behind the plot to poison the reservation wells. The article was printed on a single, long sheet of paper. Isaiah and a group of Eleanor's older students tacked a copy to the door of every business and on the post outside the church. People gathered in small, quiet groups, reading the words that laid bare the soul of their town. They read about the theft, the blackmail, and the planned massacre, and they finally understood the depth of the evil that had been living among them. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Father O'Rourke climbed the bell tower of the church. He began to ring the bell, not the slow, mournful toll for the end of the day, but a steady, cleansing peal that washed over the town. It was a sound of penance, an admission of their collective blindness, and a quiet prayer for a new beginning. Chayton did not stay in the town. He was not a man for crowds or congratulations, but his story was now a part of Red Hollow's story. The lies that had followed him for a decade had been burned away by the truth. He was no longer the shadowy, dangerous figure from the mountains. He was the man who had created the diversion, the fire that had drawn the town's anger away from its true target. He had been officially recognized for his role in exposing the railroad warehouse fire as an act of sabotage. He had not sought recognition, but it settled on him anyway, a quiet mantle of respect that felt both strange and deserved. The changes rippled outward. touching everyone. With Pike's control broken, Isaiah Brooks was able to secure the official mail contract he had long been denied. His stagecoach was no longer just a private enterprise. It was a formal link to the outside world, a symbol of the town's reconnection to the nation's laws and promises. Mei Lian, no longer needing to conduct her trade in the shadows, opened a small apothecary in a storefront on the main street. Her knowledge of herbs and remedies, once seen as foreign and suspicious, was now sought out. She became the town's unofficial doctor, a quiet testament to the community's slow, painful learning of a new kind of trust. A week after the confrontation in the canyon, a lone rider appeared at the edge of town. It was Evan Kellum. He did not ride into the main street. He went to the blacksmith shop and spent the last of his money on a new set of tools and axe, a saw, and a broad-headed hammer. He then went to the mercantile and bought sacks of nails and hinges. Eleanor saw him as he was loading his supplies onto his horse. She walked over, her steps slow and deliberate. She did not know what to say, or what he would do. He did not look at her at first. He just kept tying the sacks to his saddle. "I am leaving," he said, his voice flat, empty of the fire it had held in the canyon. "I am going to ride south, find a new valley. I am going to build a new barn." He finally turned to face her. His eyes were clear of hatred, but filled with a profound, weary sadness. "My father was who he was," he said, "and I have been who I have been. It is time to be someone else." He looked past her, his gaze going toward the high peaks of the Elk Trace Mountains. "Tell him," he said, "tell Chayton, I am sorry." He did not wait for a reply. He swung up onto his horse and rode away, not looking back. Eleanor watched him go, a solitary figure moving toward a new, unknown horizon. It was not a grand moment of reconciliation. There was no handshake, no emotional embrace. It was something quieter, and perhaps more real, a silent, unasked for moment of grace, a quiet letting go of a decade of poison. The cycle of revenge was broken, not with a bang, but with the quiet decision to build something new. The summer that followed was a season of quiet mending. The high mountain snows melted, and the creeks ran full and clear, washing the last of the fear from the valley. The red dust settled. New grass, vibrant and green, grew over the scars left by the railroad construction and the panicked hoofbeats of posses. Red Hollow was breathing again, a slow, deep, and sometimes painful breath of a patient recovering from a long fever. Chayton spent many of his days in the high country, his shoulder now a map of scarred tissue that ached in the damp of the early morning. He was not hunting or trapping with the same solitary focus as before. He was searching, high on a sun-beaten slope, in a place no one else would think to look. He had found it a thin, jagged line of dark ore running through a seam of quartz, silver. Not enough for a mine, not enough to make a man rich or draw the greedy eyes of the world, but a small, secret gift from the mountain. He built a small, makeshift forge in a sheltered overhang of rock, using a hand-cranked bellows he had traded for in a distant town. For days, he worked, his world reduced to the roar of the fire, the hiss of hot metal in water, and the rhythmic ring of a hammer on a small anvil. He melted the raw ore, separating the slag, until he had a single, gleaming puddle of pure silver. He hammered it, heated it, and hammered it again, slowly, patiently, drawing it out into a thin, strong band. He was not a silversmith. The work was crude, but it was honest work. His sweat and strength and intention poured into the metal. When he was done, he held a simple, unadorned silver ring. It was not perfectly round. The surface bore the faint, honest marks of his hammer, but it shone in the high mountain sun with a clean, bright light. The wedding was not held inside the church. They stood on the old wooden porch, the place that had once been a stage for humiliation and fear, and reclaimed it. The late summer sun slanted across the floorboards, warm and forgiving. There were no crowds, only the small circle of allies who had become family. Hannah Bluebird stood beside her brother, her composure a silent well of pride. Isaiah Brooks, his posture as straight and dignified as ever, was there with Malian, whose quiet smile held the wisdom of a survivor. Father O'Rourke, his face free of the pained anxiety that had haunted it for so long, officiated. His words were simple, speaking not of grand passions, but of the quiet courage it takes to build a life on a foundation of truth. When it came time for the ring, Chayton took Eleanor's hand. His fingers were calloused and warm around hers. He slid the imperfect silver band onto her finger. It was cool against her skin, a solid, tangible weight. This was not a settlement of a debt. It was not an exchange of property or a binding contract to be filed away in a ledger. It was a circle, freely offered and freely accepted. It was a promise made under an open sky, witnessed by the friends who had stood with them in the darkness. Eleanor looked from the ring on her finger to the quiet strength in Chayton's eyes, and she felt a peace so profound it was like coming home after a long and brutal journey. They did not build their house in the middle of the town. They chose a piece of land on the western edge of the valley, where the last of the pastures gave way to the rising foothills of the Elk Trace Mountains. It was the original Vance homestead, the deed now clear and undisputed. The house was small and sturdy, but it lacked a place to sit and watch the world. Together, they began to build a porch, a long, wide expanse of fresh-sawn pine that would wrap around two sides of the house. The work became the rhythm of their days. In the cool of the mornings, they would work side by side, the air filled with the scent of sawdust and the clean, sharp sound of a hammer hitting a nail. Chayton, with his effortless strength and knowledge of wood, cut and set the heavy support posts. Eleanor, with her meticulous nature, measured the floor planks, ensuring each one was straight and true. They were partners, their separate skills weaving together to create something new, something that would shelter them both. The porch grew under their hands, a testament to their shared labor. In the evenings, as the valley filled with the purple shadows of twilight, Chayton would often sit on the unfinished porch with a block of seasoned aspen wood and a sharp knife. He was carving, slowly, over many nights. An image began to emerge from the pale wood. It was a cradle, and on the headboard, taking shape under the patient strokes of his blade, was the powerful, soaring form of an eagle. Its wings spread wide, its head turned as if looking toward the distant peaks. He was carving a future, a hope for a new life, infused with the spirit of his ancestors and the promise of the open sky. Their life together was built of such small, quiet moments. It was not a grand romance from a storybook. It was the steady, daily labor of love. It was in the way he would build the fire in the morning, making sure the chill was gone from the room before she rose. It was in the way she would read to him in the evenings from her books, her voice a low murmur as he mended a piece of leather, the two of them sharing their different worlds. It was in the sharing of a cup of hot coffee on their new porch, watching the sunrise, a comfortable silence between them that spoke more than words ever could. Theirs was a life being built, board by board, word by word, day by day, not something seized in a moment of heroic rescue. One morning, they stood on the finished porch, leaning against the rail. The first light of dawn was spilling over the eastern mountains, bathing the valley in a soft, golden glow. From the town below, the sound of the church bell began to ring, not with the ominous clang of a summons or the frantic alarm of a fire, but with the calm, steady peal of a new day beginning. It was no longer a sound of dread, but a promise of peace. As they watched, a dark shape detached itself from the high cliffs of the Elk Trace. It was a golden eagle, catching the first updraft of the morning. It circled once, then twice, its great wings spanning the vast, silent blue of the sky. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for: freedom, endurance, and the dignity of a life lived in the light of the truth. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.